All right, hello everybody. Today I've got something for you that I hope you'll enjoy. I kind of enjoyed it, and definitely more enjoyment than non-enjoyment. I've got a review for you of Ryan Williamson's book called The Widow's Son. It is a pulpy fantasy western, and I mean fantasy western, not western fantasy. So it's Eastwood, not Tolkien. It takes place in the late 1860s, post Civil War. And it definitely layers on those fantasy aspects while still maintaining kind of a Western feel to most of the atmosphere. It's got a lot of action. A lot of that action is very well choreographed. There's a lot of really fun scenes. There's a lot of neat. There's a lot of really dark stuff going on in the story. It's got one of those really super dark settings. It's got a lot of cool tech ideas. There's kind of a little bit of a science fiction aspect, steampunkery going on in there, and there's a lot of like weird gun calibers and stuff like that are used. It's pretty fun. I mean, I have some reservations about it, but I'll say overall it was a pretty fun read. It's kind of like Larry Correia's Monster Hunter International, but in a old Western setting and for polyglots. And there'll be more on that later, which is one of the kind of downsides of this book. There's some cool characters. Unfortunately, a lot of them are like throwaway characters. It's one of those things where there's a lot of people brought in and a bunch of them die in various fights and stuff like that. And so you never know who's going to make it to the end kind of thing. But at the same time, there's not a whole lot of time spent dealing with the fact that these characters are getting introduced and then killed really quickly. And a lot of the characters are kind of thin. There's not like a whole lot of like really amazing character development going on. There's a lot of really cool obscure mythology references. It's kind of a neat mix of like American Indian, European, and Aztec ? On the Aztec, because I can't remember if Aztecs were ever actually specifically referenced, but at the same time, there's definitely an Aztec theme to some of the main bad guys, and so I feel like I might be inferring that. But I feel like I might be inferring that correctly, if that makes sense. Generally speaking, there's good description, very colorful, very visual, very olfactory. A lot of smells in the descriptions here. Generally speaking, things are very well described, and there's a lot of really good visual language, a lot of really good auditory language too. There's one exception to this, and there's basically not to spoil too much. But there are zombie hordes later in the book, and I feel like, considering what a danger they end up being, that there's not enough time spent describing how they move, how they operate, and stuff like that. They're left a little bit vague, and it's one of the few cases where things are left vague in this book, as far as descriptions of monsters and stuff go. And I kind of felt like that it would have been nice to get some cool descriptions of how they moved or how they acted or how they reacted, rather than simply describing them as kind of like a rushing wave of people. The book has the very common kind of consistently escalating stakes. Things start out relatively small and simple, and they grow rapidly. There are good points and bad points to doing this. The fact is that you can keep raising the stakes a little bit by little bit. But if you go too far, then you end up with something where the stakes just get way too high. And for like the first book, the introduction of a character, and for characters this like kind of pulpy and thin, I don't know. Going straight to end of the world in your first book kind of it always bugs me, because it's like, well, what are we going to do for your second book? Are we going to do the end of the universe, end of whatever. These constantly escalating stakes make these stories that kind of tire you out eventually. And with that said, I mean, like I'd said, it's a pretty good book. I would say that it's definitely a lot more positive than negative. I would say that I'm probably going to read the second book in the series because it's extra short. It's described as a novella, and being a novella writer myself, I will definitely probably check that out and see how it goes. But it does have a fair share of negative points. I'm going to get into those now. And before I do that, I want to make sure that it's understood that the positives outweigh the negatives pretty significantly, but I do want to outline the negatives so that people are aware of them. So one thing that I kind of found a little overused in it was authority figures have these terrible secrets. It's kind of tropey, and it's not really done in any way that is like especially creative or interesting. It's just like, oh, this guy's a bad guy. Not my favorite thing to see, and to see it multiple times in the same book, handled with about the same amount of aplomb, not so amazing in my opinion. One of the things I mentioned is that there's a lot of these characters that are introduced, and a lot of characters just get killed off really quickly. There's some groups of characters that get introduced, and they're not really developed. And what that kind of does is it gives the story kind of a vignette feel, like as if the author was saying, oh, I think this is a cool idea for a scene, so I'm going to throw this in. But the author wasn't careful enough to provide, first off, like to fill out what was in the scene, and also that he didn't provide enough connective tissue between that scene and other scenes. So some things kind of feel like they're just dropped in because, oh, it's a cool idea, which is fine. But when you notice it as clearly as I noticed it, it's a little bit jarring and kicks you out of the story a little bit. The story could have used one more good pass through with like a good line editor or something like that, or someone working as a line editor, right? I found probably approximately a dozen typos, and most of them were the kind where it's like a word substitution that was not intended. It happens. It was, I always find those jarring. I definitely have read books that I have not found any typos in going through them. And so it's possible. It's a difficult standard to achieve, but it is achievable, and many people achieve it. And like, it wasn't bad. Like, I would say probably approximately a dozen of these typos where I was like, wait, what? And then had to go back and look at it. Probably one more slow pass through the book before publishing it probably would have caught all of these. There's an ending, and I don't want to spoil anything, but there's kind of like a Deus Ex Machina element to it that is spectacular and colorful and, bombastic and amazing to visualize, right? But at the same time, it does feel kind of half-earned, like oh, this kind of came out of nowhere, and, it wasn't because the main characters were especially skilled or careful or thoughtful or whatever that got them the victory. It was the fact that all this other stuff happened to help them. And I'll say this, I realize that that's part of kind of the theme of the story, but at the same time, I just find it a little bit unsatisfying myself. There was also a couple of weird like habits of speech or habits of statement that kind of got to me a little bit. In the first third of the book, the main character is constantly saying maybe, like maybe, but MEBBE. And whenever I see MEBBE, and this is probably a me problem and not like a everybody else problem, but whenever I see MEBBE as maybe, I always kind of think of it as like a Russian accent, and it totally pulled me out of the immersion whenever I saw that. And it happens like a bunch of times in the first third of the book, and that was like, I kept hearing it in my head with a Russian accent. I'm like, that doesn't stop that, right? But that's how I saw it, and it's not really the way that I would write like a Western accent person saying maybe in a lazy way. In the second half, or maybe the third third of the book, there was also this thing that kept happening where the main character kept being described as chewing on his beard, or chewed his beard, as like being like a sign of consternation. And it happened so many times that I was like, oh, I hate reading those words, for the fourth time in the last, 10 pages. It certainly felt overused, and like, it's not a very good metaphor either. Like, I've had a beard, and like, when I nicely trimmed it, it looked like my, profile picture up in the corner somewhere. But like, I also let it get pretty long at some points. Not like long, but like long. And I never, despite being, irritated at a variety of things while I had a beard, I never found myself, inclined to chew on it. And I feel like it gives like the image I get in my head is of someone grabbing a handful of beard and shoving it into his mouth, and like it's just not. It's so undignified and silly looking in my head that it was another thing that pulled me out of the story a couple of times. Then so I said that this is kind of like Monster Hunter International, but for polyglots. And I mean, calling it Monster Hunter International is good praise. Larry Correia has created a great set of stories with the Monster Hunter International series, and his other stuff too. He's a good writer. Williamson here, the problem that I have is kind of with the polyglot part. And I'm going to describe why in a little bit of detail, because I had to think about this, why it was bugging me. So, number one, when you're constantly throwing in little bits of foreign languages into a story, it does one of two things. It either, number one, slows down how I'm reading, because I'm like, oh, this is Spanish, I need to look for a context clue to understand what this means. Or it causes my eye to skip. When I see something written in words that I don't immediately recognize, I just skip over it. And so I lose details of what's happening in the action because I'm like, oh, I don't care about this line, there's Spanish here. Oh, I don't care about this line, there's French here. There's Latin here, there's Navajo here. It's great that you included it, but at the same time, it causes my eye to skip over it. And if you put it in places where we need to know what's happening action-wise, if it's a substitute for action words or for explanations of what a character is doing, I missed it sometimes. It was especially often used in like really, really short phrases that you could kind of puzzle out if you know English and know that, and kind of pidgin Spanished it in your head, and most of the time nothing really profound was being said in these various languages. Like imagine, like you can say a line in French. You can talk about the l'esprit de l'escalier or something like that. I'm sure I'm butchering that pronouncement, but it's in English it would be the spirit of the staircase, right? It's a concept in French of getting the great idea of a comeback after you've already left the room. That's the spirit of the staircase in French. And you could use that somewhere to describe very succinctly and very carefully in an idiomatic way what a character is experiencing, that they're experiencing this feeling of, oh, I should have said this. You can do all kinds of cool things with foreign languages that way, but to have someone say, no, I don't feel like having any beans in French for no reason seemed like a waste of space to me. Plus, so there's another issue with multilingual bits in books like this, and that's that you can end up. Number one, you can have people miss context, right? If the context clue is not clear enough, I just don't know what that line meant, right? If the context clue is there, then you might be doubling or even tripling the amount of space that you're taking up with this very simple statement, right? So if someone says, oh, I'm going to have a can of beans in Spanish, and then another character says, I can't understand Spanish. And then the first character says back to the second character in English, I said I'm not going to have another can of beans. Or I said I'm going to have a can of beans. You've now used up 3 times as much space to say that this character is going to have a can of beans. And so you have to be careful about when you use multiple languages and how you use them. Because there was a bunch of person says X in language, person says X in some language, person B says, I don't understand language, and then person A has to repeat it in a different language, it's filler. It feels like filler, and it again gets my eye to that skipping part where I'm not really paying attention to it. The other thing about having a lot of little bits of multilingual stuff in a story like this is that this is not, War and Peace. This is not some highfalutin literary story where you're going on and you're having a character writing a letter in French to some other Russian noble. Like, in those cases, you're reading slowly already. You're taking your time, you're going through. This is a pulp story. This is a pulp fantasy story, right? pulp fantasy, Western, science fiction melange. And uh, pulp stories should be easy to read in general, especially action pulps like this one. Your eye should be irresistibly drawn to the next section of the next line and then on to the next line, as opposed to looking at this and saying, oh, this is a language I don't know. Okay, where's the context clue? Oh, is there no context clue? Maybe there's no context clue. Okay, can I pigeon this out by kind of like the 3 words in Spanish that I know kind of thing? Or like the 4 words in French that I know? No, probably not. And so it just ends up getting really clumsy. And you have to be really careful about doing this way. And the more clumsy you make an action story, the more time you make the reader like spend their attention on it in a bad way, in an excessive way. Whereas if you're writing an action pulp, it should flow like crazy, like Quicksilver, and having all of these different language bits slows you down way too much. The other thing about it is that, and I don't know the author personally, so I can't say whether this describes him or not, but I feel like adding all these language things in feels sometimes like self-indulgent or like humble bragging, like, oh, I know a little French, I know a little Spanish, I know some Navajo, I look, and the thing that worries me is that I wonder how idiomatic, how native some of those lines were. So background for myself is that my dad was born in Colombia, and so he speaks fluent Spanish, and his wife speaks fluent Spanish, my stepmother. And so I know, and I took some Spanish in high school, but I've been exposed to it, kind of in a natural sense for a long time. And there were some of the lines in Spanish in the book that, like, I felt were not natural. They were like somebody put an English phrase into Deep L and was like, how do I say this in Spanish? And it came out like stilted or clumsy. And so like that's another problem that can happen when you're using languages. If you're either going fast or if you're not like referencing a native spoken version of the language, you can end up with like Spanish lines or maybe even French lines. I don't know enough French. I don't know as much French as I know Spanish, even though I said 3 and 4 words. But anyway, but like, yeah, this can be one of those things where you can end up with lines that a native speaker of that language would say, that's not how that goes. The example was there is a male Japanese karate teacher whose name is Fumiko. And number 1, Fumiko is not a surname. And number 2, if it's used as a given name, it's not a man's given name either. So like there was that was one of the things where I was like, oh, he didn't look into, he just looked up a Japanese name and threw it there. Is what I suspect happened, because it didn't make sense. Because the character was definitely male. He in the book. Anyway, that's kind of my review of The Widow's Son. I recommend looking at it if it's in the genre, if it's in a genre that you enjoy. It's mostly Western and Western fantasy, with a little bit of obscure, American Indian and Aztec mythology mixed in. It's got a lot of action. It's got a lot of thin but fun characters. And it has a really good, kind of escalation, and decent pacing throughout. Like things keep building up and moving forward. And I'd say definitely more positives than negatives. Definitely some negatives to think about. But if you go grab the free sample and go through it and say, oh, this sounds good, it might be worth your time. And the sequel is apparently a novella, so it's probably pretty short too, and that might be worth your time as well. So yeah, that's my, minimal spoiler review of The Widow's Son by Ryan Williamson. I hope you'll give it a chance if it sounds like it might be something up your alley. But if it sounds like it's something that you're not into that particular combination of genres, if you don't like Western fantasy, if you don't like Westerns, if you don't like, dark settings, you might want to give it a pass, but still, always worth checking out the free sample. So yeah, that's what I've got for today. I good, happy reading. I'm going to be trying to read more and do more reviews like this, so I would love it if you'd let me know whether you thought this review was too in-depth, too short, too long, not in-depth enough, too spoilery. I tried to keep it minimal spoilery because the purpose of a review, for the purposes of like seeing a review, whether you want to read something, is to not have the whole story spoiled for you. I don't know. Anyway, any comments you have, any thoughts that you have, I'd love to hear them in the comments. Yeah, thanks for watching, thanks for listening, and I'll see you next time. My next review is going to be an old book called The Forge of God by Greg Bear. I read that a while back, and I just came back to it recently to refresh myself on it, but I'm going to be reviewing that next. So, yeah, thanks as always, and I'll see you all next time.